Welcome to the Infernal Brotherhood of the scruffy-looking Nerf herders. In this episode of How to Play West End Games' Star Wars The Role-Playing Game 30th Anniversary Edition, we are discussing optional combat rules. While many tabletop role-playing games, or TTRPGs, began as a theater of the mind-styled system, there will inevitably be player characters, or PCs, and game masters, or GMs, who are visual learners. When combat strikes especially, it's important for every player to know exactly where they are and what is happening, for even the briefest attention deviation or lack of detail described can end in total confusion and relitigating the scene or actions. The results for many players is to pull out scraps of paper and note on it where the PCs and non-player characters or NPCs and creatures are. This is incredibly important in combat scenarios. Star Wars the Role-Playing Game is intended to present, quote, fast and furious action, and while I don't personally think the opposed skill rolls pays out that concept, it is a typical game mechanic across many game systems, and in my opinion, it slows down combat when you compare it to a game like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, where you're simply trying to roll over your opposition's armor class or AC, rather than having contested rolls. So I truly don't think you lose anything by adding in some of the presented optional combat rules. If these help flesh out the realism in your game, awesome. If not, feel free to ignore them and play as presented in earlier videos. As a final note before we continue, this only applies to PCs, not ship-to-ship combat. In Star Wars the Role-Playing Game, starship combat is always more abstract and uses basic ranges as location references. As mentioned previously, at times it is helpful to have some form of a map to show where PCs are compared to NPCs, or to simply illustrate the layout of a structure or area for the PCs to engage with. Using visual aids like maps is the simplest way of adding immersion and clarity to a scene. Many published adventures contain maps with a square grid running across it. Of course, you can do a simple search engine search and find endless numbers of battle maps, in addition to using a virtual tabletop or VTT like Roll20, for example. Square grids are the standard. In these cases, and in Star Wars the Role-Playing Game, one square should represent a space 2 meters across. In the book, these are presented for use on graph paper, where you can make marks with a pencil to showcase the area. In a VTT, they allow the PCs to control their own characters on a battlefield. In this game, using a grid is only half the fun, as movement and facing is incredibly important. On paper, you can mark the facing direction with a dot or arrow. A PC can only fire a blaster or attack an NPC that they can see. You can always determine this by laying a straight edge or drawing a vertical line from the center of the facing PC's square that they're occupying to the square of their target. If the line goes through a wall or obstruction, they cannot see the NPC. The GM should not draw in a reference for an NPC or creature the PCs cannot see. At times, a PC and GM map of the same combat scene is helpful. In a VTT, you can use layers to this same effect. Rather than using maps, or in addition to using them in a VTT or tabletop battle map, you may use miniatures. When this game was released, there weren't standardized miniature sizes and gridded maps for this application, but today this is common. Miniatures are another great tool to immerse the PCs into the game, and they can empower the PCs with creativity. While gridded squares on paper maps or maps in an adventure are typically 1/4 of an inch, a miniature simply won't fit. But you can scan in those maps and enlarge them on your PC, or create them for use with a VTT or printed out battle map. So 1 inch would be equal to the 2 meter scale, and the miniature would fit fine. When using a tabletop battle map, feel free to be creative and use books, glasses, and anything else on the table as representations of structures or obstacles. When using miniatures without maps, don't feel confined to the idea of a grid square, just use a ruler for movement references with 1 inch equaling 2 meters. Rather than a default of walking 5 meters in any direction as a free action, turning any direction you want, or running 10 meters in any direction as an action, and only being able to turn up to 90 degrees, when using maps and miniatures, we use movement points. The numbers are the same, 5 movement points for walking, and 10 movement points for running. Wounded characters move at half the aforementioned rates, rounded down. When using a square grid, moving from one flat side to another costs 2 movement points. When you move diagonally from one square to another, it costs 3 movement points. This is where facing is incredibly important. Changing the facing direction costs 1 movement point per 45-degree turn. So, turning around 180 degrees would cost 4 movement points. Turning 90 degrees on the side would cost 2 movement points. As with basic combat, falling prone doesn't cost any movement, but standing up costs 4 movement points. Moving through anything other than clear terrain costs more movement points. This is outlined in the optional movement chart. Using a grid where one square represents 2 meters is an easy way of counting range. Measuring vertically or horizontally is 2 meters per square. Measuring diagonally is 3 meters per square. There are also situations that will modify the basic difficulty number for attacking a target by using terrain and stances represented in the optional fire modifiers chart. Another option to add immersion is surprise. If one group is ambushed by another, meaning one group does not know the other group is present and about to attack, the ambushers gain 1 action segment of surprise. So, in the first segment of the first combat round, only the ambushers get to attack. The targets cannot move or dodge in that first segment. The target's first action will occur on the second combat segment of the first combat round. We should also discuss ammunition. In most cases in Star Wars: The Role-Playing Game, you will not need to think about ammunition. But if there is a good reason in the adventure to use the concept, the GM should tell the PC how many rounds are in the weapon, and each shot should be tracked. This adds intensity to a scene and can add stress to the PCs, making them think more strategically than they may have otherwise thought. Replacing a battery pack removes 1 die from all subsequent actions in a combat round, but it doesn't take an action. There are also a number of factors that can increase or decrease damage done by a grenade or detonator. These are outlined in the optional grenade damage chart. Situations vary from whether the area is enclosed, if the targets are on the other side of an obstacle like a wall, whether there's a window or doorway present, and whether the target is in a vacuum. It really is up to the GM and PCs if they want to use one or all of these optional combat rules, but they can add immersion and control, empowering your players at the expense of speed and fluidity of combat. Personally, I prefer to give the PCs options when it comes to combat. This enriches the experience and heightens the tactics during an encounter, making for a more colorful and satisfying game. Thank you all for tuning in. We invite you to subscribe to this channel and click the bell to get notified about our next video. You can now join the Infernal Brotherhood through YouTube memberships and pick up some of our custom-designed Star Wars apparel by following links in the description below. Until the Infernal Brotherhood convenes again, my fellow scruffy-looking Nerf herders, may the Force be with you.